Welcome to this podcast of the League of American Orchestras, one in a series of conversations exploring the innovative practices described in Fearless Journeys, Innovation in Five American Orchestras. I'm Catherine Maciariello, your host for this discussion. Published by the League in June 2010, Fearless Journeys takes us inside five creative organizations: the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, the Pacific Symphony, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, showing how they reframe their problems and challenges, develop new strategies and pathways to success, built collaborative cultures, and found powerful new ways to engage their communities. Fearless Journeys was made possible by a generous grant from the MetLife Foundation, with additional support from the National Endowment for the Arts. The book is available as a downloadable PDF, as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at americanorchestras.org. Today we're visiting with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and with me are Sarah Lutman, President and Managing Director, and Chuck Ullery, Principal Bassoon of the SPCO. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. It's good to be here.
Well, much has already been written about the SPCO, not only in Fearless Journeys, and certainly much has been said about your artistic leadership model, which gives significant responsibility to musicians and relies on a varied group of artistic partners rather than a single music director. Since most people by now are generally familiar with what you did to change your structure, I'd like to focus on how you're continuing to pursue the innovations you implemented, how you're keeping the momentum going, so to speak. You've been doing it for a good while now, and I'd like to explore what you've learned and how you're building that learning into your future planning, how you keep the thrill of experimentation and the laboratory experience with its emphasis on continued prototyping alive and flourishing. Chuck, let's start with you. What advice would you give to others who might be thinking of ways to more effectively engage musicians in artistic planning and decision-making? Based on what you've learned, do you have two or three fundamental principles that should guide them?
Well, for me, the hobby horse that I like to ride a lot is internal education. I think with any organization, especially a group of musicians that all of us were raised to see our job with the orchestra divided into services, and we come and play our instruments, and someone else manages the orchestra, and then yet another group that we don't know usually raises the money. And we don't really have any connection with the organization and how it works. So I think internal education that really lets people know, people from the orchestra know how the organization works, what kind of money we're talking about, where the money comes from, how the artistic planning goes on, and all those things helps to make musicians come to kind of a more trusting place of a system like this.
That's great. So you're talking about education of musicians or education of board and staff. How is it sort of mutually reinforcing?
Well, I find that musicians are usually the odd man out as far as knowing what's going on in the organization. I think that traditionally there are more connections out of necessity between the board and staff. I mean, money's being raised, board committees are operating. But with musicians, they're either in a position of just speaking through the union, or thinking that sort of believing the mythology that the music director is the head of the organization, and so going to speak to the music director. To really get a handle on and really have a non-fantasy land view of how an orchestra works, I really think that I'm surprised many times how far behind the curve musicians are, and what they don't understand. I mean, not knowing what the annual fund is, not knowing who our biggest contributors are, et cetera, and certainly not knowing how artistic decisions are being made and what the financial consequences are.
So for you personally, let me just ask you this from a personal standpoint. The more you've become involved in understanding the logistical and operational concerns, financial management, et cetera, of the organization, have you seen a direct correlation between that knowledge and your ability to do better artistic planning and make more informed decisions around the artistic activities of the organization from your own personal standpoint?
From my own personal standpoint, it makes me a lot happier to know what's going on and to know that people do see the same problems I do and are trying to attack them, and there are people actually busy doing a lot of work off outside of the concert hall. And there's a lot of activity going on that, when I first came into the business 40 years ago, I had absolutely no idea of how an orchestra ran. And now it may have made me more sympathetic to how things go, but it also gives me a chance to figure out where I could help. I mean, personally, I love working with people in development. I love seeing what they're doing and asking questions and learning and going on calls and calling up people myself. I find that extremely rewarding. And so I think with more education, people can find where they can fit in a collaborative organization. But Kathy, I want to say one more thing because
sure.
It's that I'm sorry to go on so long about this, but for me, a big hump to get a lot of people over, a lot of musicians over, is what collaborative means, and especially in our case. I think, and the way I try to explain to musicians is that having a collaborative organization means that you're free to go and seek out information, go to meetings, sit in on committee meetings, and then at some point in the future, you may know enough and have made enough associations with people that people will value what you have to say. And its collaboration is not one group makes a decision and then they bring it to the musicians and we take a vote. That's not collaboration. So I'm trying to make that distinction with people. So.
I think that's a really good point, and we've explored that with some other orchestras too. And I think the other thing that we're not talking about is decision making by committee. Everybody has a really important role to fill, and the more open the communication channels are between the various constituencies, the more informed the decisions are, the richer the conversations, the greater sense of ownership people feel. And we've heard that from a lot of people in these conversations. As I was listening to you, too, talk about it, and I had asked you before about how knowing about the organization had helped you make artistic decisions, it almost seems to me that I should have asked it the other way around, is that the more involved you are in doing artistic planning, the closer the relationship one can see to the impact of the art itself on fundraising and marketing and other parts of the organization. And I hadn't thought about that until I was listening to you talk. Mm-hmm. Sarah, I want to ask you a question sort of in this context and ask you how it's all playing out today within the orchestra. Surely you've made changes and adjustments to move the work forward and to keep your principles and values looking ahead while still understanding that not everything is going to work as you expected it might. So what have you had to do to keep things moving ahead?
Well, this happens to be a strategic planning year at the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, so we'll now be in the third 5-year planning cycle since the first one, which really defined a lot of rather than say defined, I guess I would say initiated a lot of the changes that have occurred in the organization over the past decade. And it's a wonderful moment for us to come together as a community of staff, musicians, and board and volunteers to talk about what an ideal SPCO will look like in 20 years and what are the next things we need to do to get there. And I think that we will spend time reflecting on some of the specifics of things like our artistic leadership model to ask what parts of this are serving us well, which are lots and lots of things, and where do we see room for improvement, and what might those improvements look like. And I think that part of what is in place at the SPCO that will now be very difficult to rinse out, if you will, through time, is that we are constantly looking for better ways to do things, and that there's a real culture in the organization that however scary change may be, and whatever choice you feel that you're making when you decide to make a change, that staying the same is also a choice. And with the world changes as much as it is, staying the same is probably not a great choice much of the time. So we just have that as an underlying culture in the organization. And as new people come in, they're encouraged to question and find out, why do you do things this way? Well, did you think about doing it that way? And that includes board members, that includes new staff, and that includes all musicians who join the orchestra.
Well, as time passes, what you're getting at, I think, are questions of sustainability, and you've made what appears to be a sort of permanent culture change within the organization. So one begins to wonder, okay, how is this sustained over time? New musicians come in, and you spoke about that. New staff comes in, including you. I mean, you weren't there when the initial experiment began, but now you're caretaking it and moving it forward into new iterations. And so maybe with both of you, we could explore a little bit more deeply how you go about transferring values, culture, and learning within the organization. I mean, through the strategic planning process and other mechanisms. How do you consciously go about moving the process of innovation forward so that it's iterative and continues to reinforce your will and energy? Both of you could address that, I think.
Chuck, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd like to go first because I want to praise Sarah for she's having musician meetings which are compulsory. It sounds kind of strange, but again, it goes back to what I said about having musicians seeing their life divided into services, rehearsals, and concerts. And I think that really to be a professional, collaborative musical organization, we have to have this kind of meeting where musicians are being educated and trying to, where we have a new hall being built. So Sarah had a wonderful meeting last week telling us what was going on with the new hall. And the week before we did it, we had a meeting on what was going on with the strategic planning process so the musicians could be brought up to speed on that. It seems like if it were a business in the real world, if Sarah said, I need everyone to come in early on Tuesday because I need to talk to you guys about something, we would have to do it. But since we're in the world of musicians and services, we have to schedule it. So maybe someday we'll move beyond that. But for now, at least we're having that kind of educational process, which I think is just great. I was saying to Sarah before this phone call, too, that I think it's vital that we do that and bring people up to speed, because otherwise people in the organization that are unhappy about something in the organization will do the service for us. I mean, they'll perform the service for us and bring the person up to speed as far as they see things.
Right. Well, and the other thing is that my experience, and I am still relatively new, I haven't crossed my 2-year mark, is that people lead very busy lives, and our musicians do a lot of things in the community between their families, whatever volunteer work they may do, their other musical groups they may perform with, and teaching, that if you rely on volunteerism, even when a subject is very compelling to someone's work life and future, sometimes it's difficult for them to participate. So a reasonable approach is for the organization to look for ways to incorporate information sharing, training, or just plain dialogue into the orchestra schedule. And that's something that we instituted this year, and we'll see how it goes. But to me, it's a way, you actually build it into what constitutes the orchestra's workday, so that everyone can participate and receive the same information and hear the same questions. The concert hall meeting that Chuck is referring to, one of the reasons we wanted to have it is so that every musician in the orchestra had the opportunity to ask questions directly to the architect and acoustician about exactly what is happening in the design of the new concert hall. And it was fascinating to hear the range of questions that musicians asked, and it will make a better building. So I think part of the learning is figuring out how you create structures for participation that also fit within a reasonable work day, or, in the board's case, the board schedule, to make sure that you're being inclusive.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I wonder if there are probably people who are listening who are from full-size symphony orchestras as opposed to chamber orchestras. And I wonder if you might address what you think about this process is applicable in a larger institutional setting. How much of this is easier for you to do because you have a fewer number of musicians? What could someone take away from this conversation if they're dealing with 80 or 100 or 110 musicians?
Sarah?
Well, any time that you try to take something to scale, you have to think about what needs to be different. And a perfect example would be if you're a cook and something works in certain proportions in the home kitchen, and then you decide to quadruple the recipe, you don't just times 4 each of the ingredients. That's not how it works. You will not get the same dish. And so people who are trying to do the opposite, like make a cookbook for their restaurant, have to test the recipes at a smaller scale to see if they work. And so I think people would need to look at what elements of how we operate might apply and figure out what their own multiple is and see what about our example seems to be adding vibrancy and adding success to our organization and figure out how to replicate it in their own. I don't think simple looking at our model and then trying to do it is even a good idea. But I do think that some of the good things that have happened is we have really exciting programming. It has huge variety, much more variety because the musicians are involved and suggesting things they want to play and suggesting combinations of things, and also with our artistic partner model where they're constantly different people playing with the orchestra. This has made a very energized artistic product, if you will, that the community really appreciates too. So some of the things that have made concerts exciting and playing in the orchestra more interesting are things that I think it would be fascinating for a big orchestra to explore.
It seems to me that what I'm hearing you say, too, is that as someone's looking at your model, the takeaway for them is not so much what you did, but the principles behind what you did, and trying to look at what's applicable about those principles in a different context and a different environment. And the second sort of part of that is the prototyping that goes on. You try and you massage, and then you try and you adjust, and then you try something new, and you build on that learning until you have a critical mass. And it seems to me that that's a process that's applicable in almost any situation. You mentioned
could I say
go ahead.
Something
Sorry.
about that just my life experience is that too many people see innovation as in a success-fail paradigm, and it's the absolute wrong paradigm. It's test, learn, try, learn. It's not success-fail. You don't build. It's not like an experiment where you build a rocket and if it doesn't go off, well, you're never going to build another one again. You're constantly learning and tweaking. And I think if it's one thing I would encourage anyone, no matter what kind of business they're in, is don't look at it as a success and failure. Say, oh, what did I learn from that? And that actually mimics the practice habits of musicians, actually. So it should be something that culturally we should all be able to get to. Don't you think so, Chuck? Have you ever thought about that? Oh,
that's a great way to put it. It makes me more optimistic.
It's a wonderful image, isn't it? It's such a good point, and I want to hop to something you also were talking about earlier. You made references to the artistic partners, and I don't want us to conclude without asking Chuck to comment a bit on that. The SPCO made a conscious decision to move away from a single authority figure, a single artistic authority figure, and I'd like to ask you what kind of new questions and challenges are emerging as you gain more and more experience in working with your artistic partners. I'm sure people would be interested in hearing your assessment of how that goes and changes and it continues to improve.
Well, I had a feeling that it would be a good thing. I was persuaded when we first went to the artistic partners that it was a good move to make, namely because we could get an array of people that wouldn't have the title attached to the name, so they might feel freer to come here if they weren't a secondary assistant conductor or associate or something like that. They would actually come here and have their 3 or 4 weeks and have their own sort of mini season to plan. But I had no idea how great it was and how great it would be and how many ways it would affect the orchestra. And I think about this a lot. First of all, just the experience of having those people come, those men and women come as artistic partners. First of all, I think that those people, those artistic partners and the orchestra are on better behavior because of that. than something that evolves, or
the
passive aggressiveness that evolves under even the greatest music director. The stuff that kind of the currents that go on, but he told me this, but no, and he fired my friend, the whole thing. And also, I was describing it to Sarah before as being like this local. Maybe it's a national organization that's called It's Just Lunch. Where you meet somebody. It's sort of a dating service, and you meet for lunch. And I think it's that way. I feel like we're dating these people, and we're friends with them afterwards. We don't marry any one of them. We may. But we have a great time. It's like they become part of our family. It's like an uncle or an aunt that we don't see for a few years, and they come back, or then they get to visit us 3 times a year for 3 years in a row, and it's just wonderful. But the thing the overriding thing is, together with having those artistic partners, we've started to do more unconducted weeks, and that makes us realize what we get and what we don't get from conductors. That's the number one thing. And number two is I think everyone in the orchestra now feels responsible for what happens on stage. In many orchestras, I don't know how many people outside of orchestras realize this, but in some orchestras, if you would go to someone in another section and say, I think you come in a little early there at letter A, the person's answer many, many times would be, well, if it were wrong, the conductor would tell me. So I don't want to hear from you. And you are? I don't even know you. Who are you telling me this? You're someone in the back of the viola section. How do you know? Here people seek out that kind of thing, and you can feel with impunity. I mean, of course, there are always exceptions. Some people are pricklier than others, but I feel that I could go, to the principal cellist from the bassoon section, in a place I'm not even playing, and say, Ron, I think that it's a little slow there. I think when your first note of your solo seems a little high to me, and he would say, "Oh, thanks, I'll listen to that."
Well, that's
would
great.
Not happen in other places, because we feel that we're all responsible for what comes out when the performance happens. So you better do something about it if you hear something wrong.
It doesn't allow much room for apathy.
No,
it doesn't.
Yeah,
it really doesn't.
And it seems like that really permeates the organization, because in so many orchestras you see that an organization really often reflects the kind of culture that you see on stage. And having worked in orchestras, I've seen that is that the parts of the organization do feed off each other. And so I think if there's that genuine and constant engagement on the stage, it really inspires other people within the organization to approach their work the same way. So it's great to hear that. It makes me wonder, and I want to ask you, Sarah, about how that does spill over, because no innovation strategy is really discrete unto itself. Its impact gets felt throughout the organization, and I'm sure often in very unexpected ways. So as we move toward the conclusion here, I'd like to ask you how the changes that you've made to the artistic leadership model at the SPCO created unexpected leverage maybe in other areas.
Well, I think the question of which comes first here may be valid, because I think our board has very much developed this culture internal to itself, and that culture was consciously developed by Lowell Notaboom and Bruce Kopic while they led the organization, and that has had a energizing effect on our governance. And our board members are always 10 years ahead in aspiration of most of us. In our wildest imagination, will then talk to a board member and say, wouldn't it be cool if X? And they'll say, well, of course, but what about Y? And it's even more ambitious. And I think that the engine, or it's more of a virtuous cycle that's going on now, where all elements of the organization are alert. They're playing as well as listening, as Chuck just described it. And it makes it really fun to be part of what we informally call the SPCO family, and it feels very much like we're in it together. And in that way, I feel extraordinarily privileged to be what is called here managing director as opposed to executive director. And I take that quite to heart, that the job of the paid leader here is to try to keep the energy and momentum going, but not necessarily to be the hierarchical leader in the traditional sense.
Yeah, that makes great sense, and it's a really good distinction. You mentioned once to me something about how the work that you've done in the artistic leadership model actually you felt helped lead to some of your experiments in offering lower ticket prices and playing neighborhood concerts, and that it in unexpected ways actually improved your connections with the community. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think the community can tell that our musicians are all about giving great concerts. And so in that sense, I think it has an energizing effect. Now, what energy is generated on stage is palpable to the audience. So in that sense, I think it's a direct effect of people who attend concerts of what's happened inside the organization. In terms of whether the ticket innovation, if you want to call it that, the drastic lowering of ticket prices across all of our venues is directly related, I would be, if that occurred, maybe Chuck would be the one to say it. I think they were parallel and complementary, if not synergistic, elements of extremely exciting kind of whitewater period in the life of the SPCO. But I don't know if they really were directly related. Were they, Chuck?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think they were. I can't really elaborate on that too much. I mean, I'm speechless.
Well, it seems maybe that, like you're right, that it's a sort of mutually reinforcing and sort of simultaneous thing, but that the courage to actually experiment in one area is driven by the success you find in experimenting in another area. So I think an organization that is alert to that impact and to those effects within its operations, actually, then it doesn't seem like one leads to another. It's much more organic, but clearly they must be related because you've had such great success in doing it. I really want to thank both of you, Sarah and Chuck. It was a great discussion, and we wish you well as you continue on this journey and on your work at the SPCO. And thank you once again for joining us. For more information, we invite our listeners to contact the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and certainly to read Fearless Journeys. Just a reminder, Fearless Journeys is available as a downloadable PDF as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at AmericanOrchestras.org. Thank you for joining us.